A lot of important conversations in this one, some more comfortable than others. Welcome back to Can We Talk About the Apothecary Diaries in Excruciating Detail, the series where we overanalyze every single word, meaningful glance, and imperial decree that this story throws our way. My name is Yumna, my current hyperfixation is the Apothecary Diaries, and today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 9, where some mysterious deaths happen back to back, and during their investigation, Jinshi and Mao Mao have a hard conversation that definitely puts their relationship and dynamic into a new perspective. This episode opens with a party. Some government workers and bureaucrats are drinking and making conversation, but there seems to be something a little bit off about the evening. Specifically, the way that some of the attendees view one specific bureaucrat who is sitting on his own, guzzling down drink after drink, jug after jug of alcohol. We then cut to Gaoxuan struggling to get Jinshi back on course after the whole debacle at the end of the last episode at the Jade Pavilion, where Gyokyo did eventually tell Gaoxuan and Jinshi that Mao Mao introduced Lee Haku to Pyrene, a top-ranked courtesan, in exchange for him being her guarantor, and that she did not personally provide the night of blissful dreams, but clearly it was still a jarring experience nonetheless, which we get some more context for as Gaoxuan explains that Jinshi completed all of his documentation, all of his work post the garden party quite quickly with a lot of determination and focus because he wanted to be able to go over to the Jade Pavilion to see Mao Mao, but he arrived a day late after she had already left for her homecoming. Gaoxuan then reflects on Jinshi's behavior in general lately, and I think that his musings are really interesting in what they tell us about who Jinshi is and also what Mao Mao's impact has been not only on him but on the Rear Palace in general, with Gaoxuan saying things like, "The Jinshi I know would never resort to such childish behavior. The Jinshi I know would never get so attached to a toy." I mentioned in the last episode that a large part of Gaoxuan's job, I would argue the biggest part of his job currently, is to keep Jinshi on course and to keep him from wavering in the work that he has to do. And I think it's clear that it has been more straining and difficult for him to do that as of late over the past year since Mao Mao became a more regular fixture in Jinshi's life. Something that obviously I don't think that we as viewers are unaware of, given how we have seen Jinshi interact with Mao Mao and how it is quite discernibly different from the way that he interacts with other people in the Rear Palace, and vice versa. Mao Mao also interacts with him very differently than everybody else in the Rear Palace does. Especially in more recent episodes like the garden party, we have really started to see this Jinshi the eunuch facade come off when he is interacting with Mao Mao, where in these interactions, Mao Mao notes that Jinshi feels more raw and real and not sparkly and so pleasant that it's unnerving and slightly inhuman. But I do think it's interesting to see this vocalized by somebody who knew Jinshi pre-Mao Mao, which we are not in that camp. And while this obviously speaks to the impact that Mao Mao has had on Jinshi with her intelligence, her eccentricism, and her ability to see through his sparkly facade and not be so blindly impressed by it in the way that everybody else is, but I think it also speaks to something that we talked about in one of the earlier videos in this series, which is Mao Mao's general presence being disruptive in the Rear Palace. Her social status and unconventional and inventive methods for problem solving have thrown a lot of people in this enclosed space into a tizzy. So is she changing Jinshi by challenging his understanding of things and eliciting emotion from him that forces him to pull back on this sparkly eunuch facade? Yes, absolutely. But she's also changing the world that she's in at large. A main character, if I ever saw one. We then find out that Sir Conan, the bureaucrat that we saw at the party earlier, has allegedly died from drinking too much. And Jinshi seems to be very visibly upset by this. Now, the scene where he breaks the news to Gyokyo with Mao Mao in the room as well at the Jade Pavilion plays out pretty much the exact same way in both the anime and the light novel, but the anime leaves out a little tidbit about just social customs and really policy in the Rear Palace when it comes to how eunuchs can interact with high-ranking concubines. In the anime, Mao Mao notes that it's pretty clear that Jinshi thinks that something else happened here beyond just over drinking because Hongyang has been sent out of the room for this conversation, meaning that it needs to be private and just between between Jinshi, Mao Mao, Gaoshun, and Gyokyo. But in the light novel, Mao Mao notes that a eunuch and a high-ranking concubine actually can't ever be alone together. There always has to be a lady in waiting there to act as a chaperone. And because Hong Yang was the one sent out of the room, even though typically because she is a higher ranking lady in waiting, she's the head lady in waiting, she would be the one to stay with Gyokyo, Mao Mao clues into the fact that Jinshi is about to ask her to do something because he doesn't fully believe the story that he's being told about what happened to Sir Conan. But regardless of what Jinshi thinks, Mao Mao believes that this is a pretty open and shut case. But Jinshi's argument for why it's not is that Sir Conan was notorious for being able to handle his alcohol. Mao Mao also learns that Conan was considered to be a dynamic warrior and was well liked by the people around him, which is interesting when we consider the way that people were talking about him at the party. During their investigation, Mao Mao notes that Jinshi is acting meek and that she would prefer it if he was being his normal, sparkly, shiny self. And she also notes that lately Jinshi has just been behaving more like a child. Honestly, very similar musings and reflections to the ones that Gaoshun has earlier. And I think the wording choice here is interesting because at the garden party, when we see the Jinshi the eunuch persona kind of fall off, when he is incredibly irritated with the general circumstances, the incident, the poisoning, the fact that Mao Mao wants to eat more of the poison, Mao Mao notes that she prefers when Jinshi is acting younger, aka his actual age, because it seems less performative. And here she isn't saying that she generally prefers Jinshi as the sparkly eunuch, but that his sparkly persona is easier to deal with in this context when she is working on something, which makes sense because it's something that she's become accustomed to, and there is a level of predictability when Jinshi has this persona on in terms of what he'll say and do. But this version of Jinshi, this more raw and real authentic version of Jinshi, is not predictable in that way. I also think that sincerity in general can be uncomfortable, especially when Mao Mao is in the position that she's in, because it's one thing for Jinshi the sparkly eunuch to ask his toy to investigate something that happened in the rear palace, and an entirely different thing for Jinshi the person to ask Mao Mao to look into something because it has genuinely affected him. Something else that I have been thinking about as I've been rewatching these episodes is that these moments where Jinshi is acting more like his true authentic self and less like Jinshi the eunuch in his interactions with Mao Mao have, for the most part up until this point, been very circumstantial moments. Jinshi isn't necessarily trying to do away with this persona intentionally to get closer to Mao Mao. It's just kind of happened naturally as the pair have found themselves in certain situations. Situations like Jinshi hearing Mao Mao's kidnapping story and how she ended up in the rear palace in the first place, which leads him to giving her a hairpin. Jinshi finding Mao Mao rinsing her mouth out after she ate the soup that had poison in it, and finding out that a minister also ate the soup because he didn't believe that Mao Mao was actually poisoned because of how easily she walked off the stage, and how this whole thing is now going to become an incident because of that. And then on top of that, Mao Mao asking if she can have more poison. Jinshi then confronting her after she comes back from her homecoming off the heels of this whole garden party incident, and him finding out that she went home with another man despite the fact that he also gave her a hairpin that she could have used. And now here with them investigating Sir Conan's death, this person that Jinshi genuinely cared about, off the heels of the garden party, of him finding out that Mao Mao went home with another man, to him thinking that Mao Mao gave that man a night of blissful dreams to go home, to him finding out that that actually wasn't the case. He's had a lot going on in these moments, and I imagine that that makes it much more difficult to maintain this sparkly, very pleasant persona. And then Jinshi and Mao Mao have one of, if not the most normal conversation that they have had up until this point. And by normal, I mean one where Jinshi is not being his normal sparkly self, and as a result of that, Mao Mao is not off-put by his sparkle. Where Jinshi is speaking with a lot of fondness about Sir Conan's eating habits, where he used to really enjoy spicy food until one day he suddenly developed a sweet tooth, which led to all of his meals looking more like dessert, to which Mao Mao responds, "That'll give you diabetes." Jinshi then tells her to not spoil his nostalgia with reality, and also asks her if she intends on drinking the entire bottle of alcohol that him and Gaoshun brought her for investigative purposes. Now, this conversation is obviously important in what it tells us about Conan's food preferences, which are going to come into play later in this episode, but it also showcases where Jinshi and Mao Mao's relationship is at this point, where they can have a conversation like this that feels incredibly casual, like two people on equal footing, just having a very normal back-to-back and not a commoner talking to a nobleman who is also the manager of the place that she works. Like, look at this expression on Jinshi's face. That man does not care about how he is being perceived. Then we cut to Mao Mao determining Conan's cause of death using his medical records and the remnants of the smashed jug that he was drinking out of at the party that night. And Jinshi was right. It was not from excessive drinking, but rather from excessive salt consumption. Now, why would a man not be able to taste the amount of salt he was consuming? According to Mao Mao, her best guess is that after losing his wife and child in an epidemic, Conan, in his grief, developed an ailment that severely compromises a person's ability to taste. Hence why he couldn't taste the salt that he was consuming, and also probably why he could only find enjoyment in eating sweet foods later on in his life. Now we're going to take a quick little intermission from the main storyline to provide another little tidbit difference between the light novel and the anime, because in the anime, Jinshi has an office that he uses, this office space that we have seen many times and we also see in this episode, but in the light novel, he actually does not have a designated office space. So every time him and Mao Mao meet in an office, it's not actually his office, it's the office of the matron of the serving women. And that is the reason that in this episode, they're not in the office. They are in a guardhouse, the same guardhouse that Mao Mao met up with Lee Haku in, because the serving woman's office is a little bit too busy in the light novel for Jinshi to use that space. I just think that's very funny that he is just like office hopping in the light novel, which he is not doing in the anime. Okay, intermission over. Now back to the actual story at hand. So while Mao Mao doesn't specifically pinpoint the perpetrators responsible for what happened to Conan, she provides Jinshi and Gaoxuan with enough insight to continue their investigation, where she suggests that somebody might have tried to prank the bureaucrat who was very by the book and uptight in a way that some people might not have liked. Now that she's done her job and she's being dismissed, as they are getting up to leave the guardhouse, Mao Mao notices that Jinshi has an obsidian tassel on his waist, a sign that he is in active mourning. She then asks Jinshi if Conan really was that great of a person, and Jinshi answers by getting this look of fondness and sadness on his face as he tells her that Conan had helped him when he was young. And Mao Mao notes that in this moment, Jinshi looks like a real person, which just further cements the importance of this interaction when it comes to the dynamic between these two characters. I do think it's kind of funny, though, that in the light novel, when Mao Mao is asking this question, the rationale that she provides for why she words it this way of like, oh, was he really that great, is because she doesn't want to directly ask Jinshi if him and Conan were close, because she is worried that the answer that she gets might be indecent. Continuing this bit that Jinshi is somebody who maybe has relations with the emperor, maybe has relations with some other powerful men in the imperial palace because of his good looks. Jinshi then gives Mao Mao a bottle of booze to thank her for her help with the investigation today, and with that, our moment of genuine, earnest emotion and vulnerability is over, and we are back to our regularly scheduled programming with these two, which the soundtrack also lets you know that we are so back, because Jinshi proceeds to smile his typical sparkly eunuch smile and get up in Mao Mao's face and tell her that he expected a little more gratitude from her than just a thank you so much. Mao Mao then proceeds to let him know that she is not going to kiss his feet, and she also calls him out for probably slacking on the other work that he has to do, which she is not wrong. But Jinshi still counters nonetheless by telling her that he takes his work quite seriously. And when Mao Mao asks him what he does, he lets her know that there is a bill currently on his desk that is proposing that the legal drinking age in the country be upped to 20 in order to prevent the youth from becoming addicted, which obviously for Mao Mao, certified alcohol fiend, is horrified at, and proceeds to beg him to not let this pass. And as if one mysterious death was not enough, we cut to a shot of a woman sinking into the rear palace moat. Mao Mao and the quack doctor are called to the scene because based on what this woman is wearing, she is likely a servant at the rear palace. Now we see that unsurprisingly, Mao Mao is much more comfortable around corpses than the quack doctor is, given the fact that she grew up around them on the outskirts of the pleasure district, but when he asks her to perform the autopsy, she refuses. And at this point, Jinshi and Gaoxuan have arrived at the scene, and everybody is a little bit intrigued and confused about why Mao Mao can't perform this autopsy. And this is where we learn that Loman has expressly forbidden her from touching and interacting with corpses because human remains can be used as medicinal ingredients. And Loman wagers that if Mao Mao were to start interacting with corpses, like performing autopsies and doing stuff like that it would only be a matter of time before she was robbing graves. And after hearing this, Jinshi and Gaoxuan very quickly concur with Loman, which Mao Mao finds to be a little bit rude, but also a really great example of the ethics of science and scientific research. So the quack doctor performs the autopsy, and upon seeing this woman's body in full, Mao Mao goes quite deep into thought, reflecting on how cold this woman probably was in the water at this time of year because it's winter. And Jinshi notices a strange look on Mao Mao's face, but doesn't say anything. Then we cut to what is, in my opinion, one of the most important conversations that Jinshi and Mao Mao have, not just in this first season, but in the story of the Apothecary Diaries in general. The conversation opens with Jinshi confirming that the woman who drowned was in fact a servant at the rear palace who, according to reports, seemed normal yesterday. And the most probable cause of death right now seems to be suicide. When Jinshi asks Mao Mao for her take on the situation, she tells him that she can't confirm for sure that it was suicide, but what she can wager is that the woman did not get up to the top of the wall herself. And this is where we learn that after the incident with concubine Fuyo, Mao Mao was always bothered by how she was able to climb to the top of the rear palace walls at all, because there is no ladder, there are no steps, there's nothing. And so she conducted her own independent investigation and found that there were these protrusions of bricks, likely made by the builders who made the wall, to climb up. But even with these protrusions, it would have been incredibly challenging for a woman in the rear palace to scale this wall, especially if you have your feet bound in the way that this servant did. Now, in case people don't know, foot binding is a process by which the foot is broken and then wrapped very tightly in order to shape it in a certain way, specifically to make it smaller in the case of ancient China. And this is something that would start when women were quite young in order to ensure that their feet stayed small and didn't grow, because small feet were a beauty standard at the time, and Mao Mao also notes this. And I think we can all imagine that scaling a wall would be incredibly difficult given the fact that even walking is a challenge when your feet are bound, and Mao Mao notes that there is a specific walking style that she sees in the rear palace that lets her know that a woman's feet are bound. And this was left out of the anime, but the light novel notes that the reason that Fuyo was able to scale this wall is because she was a talented dancer and had those skills with footwork that would allow her to be able to navigate even with those small protrusions. Given what he's just heard, Jinshi asks Mao Mao if she thinks that this might be murder then. And while Mao Mao does not have an answer for this, she tells him that it's pretty safe to assume that this woman was alive when she fell into the moat, given the fact that her fingers were all bloodied and red, likely from her clawing at the walls to try to get herself out of this moat. And it's from this moment on that this conversation takes a very different turn, where Mao Mao starts to reflect upon death, how it is inevitable, but how none of us know when we're going to leave this world and how it's going to happen. And that in their world, the rear palace and the imperial court in general, people have agendas and vendettas that can lead to sabotage, that can lead to losses in life. And this pondering on Mao Mao's part makes sense. One, given the fact that we have had 2 unexpected deaths in this episode, but also because Mao Mao is very aware of her position. She is aware of how her being in service to Gyokyo and her also, being called upon by Jinshi to do various things puts her in proximity to these, potential opportunities for sabotage. And that even though she very much does not want to die, she can get put in situations that put her life in jeopardy. And then we get a montage of all of the death and misfortune that has befallen characters in the story so far. Now, after this reflection, Mao Mao asks Jinshi a question that elicits quite a strong emotional response from him, which is that if there was ever a time where he was tasked with executing her, can he make sure that it is done via poison? Now, Jinshi is understandably very shocked by this question and gets quite upset and is really just kind of like, where is this coming from? To which Mao Mao responds that if an order was given to execute her, it would likely be on him to carry it out given his position in the rear palace. Jinshi's initial response to this is a bout of silence, because while Mao Mao is being quite straightforward and quite abrupt here, she is not wrong in her assessment of what he would have to do if these circumstances happened. He is still defensive though, and tells her that that is not something that is ever going to happen, which is a bit naive of him. And Mao Mao points out this naivete in her response indirectly, where she reminds Jinshi that she is a commoner whose life can be taken at even the smallest error if somebody wanted to, reminding him that they are not on equal footing in this dynamic. But that doesn't stop Jinshi from growing increasingly emotional, where he fires back telling her that he would never do that. And Mao Mao responds by saying something that not only encapsulates Jinshi's social position within this dynamic between the two of them, but also speaks to social class in this story and in this world in general, which is that it's not about would or would not, but rather it's more can or cannot. And I fear she gagged him quite literally, because Jinshi goes silent and Mao Mao notes that it seems like she has struck a nerve. And with him clearly having nothing more to say, Mao Mao takes her leave. Now, up until this point, Jinshi and Mao Mao's dynamic has been shown to us in a much more lighthearted way and has been played for comedy a lot of the time. And this is not to say that comedic relief will no longer be a part of their interactions. Those two are going to give us so much to laugh about as the story continues. But this conversation, especially coming off of the heels of their moment at the garden party and their moment while investigating Sir Conan, where they were having this very easy conversation and banter that really made it feel like these were two people on very equal footing, makes the reality presented to us in this conversation incredibly sobering. Because regardless of whether Jinshi would or would not personally do certain things, does not negate the fact that he could absolutely do them if he wanted to. And so there is this power dynamic in him and Mao Mao's relationship that puts her in a precarious position in a way that it does not for him, whether he wants to acknowledge that reality or not. And I think that if we zoom out a little and take Jinshi's real identity into account, this conversation and his reaction to what Mao Mao says in this conversation also showcases how succeeding the emperor is not something that he wants to do. And I would also argue at this point that he is not ready to do, because to rule over people and to have absolute power in the decisions that you are making, such as who gets to live and who doesn't get to live, are not easy things to bear. Those are very, very heavy responsibilities to have. And that to be a leader in the world of the Apothecary Diaries, where political alliances change and circumstances change, is to make calls that can result in the loss of lives, potentially in the losses of lives of people that you have grown to care about if they have betrayed you. It isn't easy to separate yourself emotionally from people. And I'm not saying that it's a good thing to have to do. I don't think that the way that the emperor operates in this world is great as far as leadership goes. I don't think that absolute monarchies are optimal. But this is the world that we're living in. And to be a person whose word is literally the word of the heavens is to live separately from the people that you love the most and that you cherish the most. Because in many ways, your life and the decisions that you make are not your own. They are made in the best interests of the country and its people. And that, I don't think, is something that Jinshi and just people in general would find easy or particularly pleasant to navigate. And then we cut to Jinshi talking to Gaoxuan, clearly not in the best mood given this conversation that he has just had with Mao Mao, where Gaoxuan finally has an update for him on who in the rear palace has burn marks. This is from that whole tablet, colored fires, secret message situation that we were first introduced to a couple of episodes ago. Something that Jinshi, in his bad mood, points out that he asked Gaoxuan to find like 2 months ago. And we find out that the culprit with burn marks on their arm is none other than Feng Ming, Lady Oduo's head lady in waiting at the Garnet Pavilion. And that is all for this episode. How did you all feel about these conversations that Jinshi and Mao Mao had and the implications that they have on their dynamic going forward? Let me know in the comments. And as always, can we talk about that?